the early decades of the 19th century, America was still carving out its identity. Towns were growing, borders shifting, and communities built themselves upon hard labor, faith, and an unshakable belief in progress. Yet beneath the optimism of expansion lurked darker truths, for the frontier was not only a land of opportunity, but also a land where cruelty, secrecy, and lawlessness often went unchecked. It was within this fragile balance of civilization and wilderness that the story of Ezekiel Drummond began. A story so disturbing, so baffling to the early understanding of human behavior, that those who encountered him described him as a living question mark, a walking paradox, a man whose very existence challenged what science, medicine, and morality could explain. The year was 1824, and Ezekiel Drummond lived in a remote Kentucky settlement. Though his presence was felt well beyond its borders, he was not a wealthy landowner, nor was he a man of high standing in the church or politics. In fact, on the surface, Drummond appeared to be little more than a common farmer. Quiet, reserved, a man who toiled at the soil like everyone else. But behind this modest facade lay behaviors and tendencies that would leave his neighbors whispering in dread and local physicians scratching their heads. To this day, Drummond is remembered less as a man than as a phenomenon, one of those rare figures in history who embodies the unsettling truth that not all horrors come from outside of us. Some are born within. From childhood, Ezekiel exhibited signs that disturbed those around him. In an era when children were expected to be obedient, hardworking, and respectful, he seemed different, aloof, calculating, and strangely indifferent to the feelings of others. Neighbors later recalled that he had a cruel streak, one that expressed itself not through loud tantrums, but through a cold, deliberate delight in causing discomfort. Farm animals found maimed, playmates injured in ways they couldn't quite explain, younger children terrorized when no adults were around. These patterns followed Ezekiel into adolescence. His parents, devout and stern, interpreted his behavior as sin, believing that harsher discipline and stricter adherence to scripture would correct him. But instead of breaking his spirit, their punishments only seemed to make him more cunning, more skilled at hiding his true nature from those in authority. By the time Ezekiel reached his late teens, the whispers in the community had begun to solidify into reputation. He was intelligent, undeniably so, with a sharpness that often surprised teachers and ministers. Yet intelligence without compassion is a dangerous combination, and Drummond's cleverness seemed to serve darker impulses. While other young men his age courted women, built futures, or dreamed of adventure, he occupied himself with meticulous experiments on animals, recording observations in notebooks that have, miraculously, survived in fragments. These notes, rediscovered much later, reveal a chilling attention to detail, measurements of suffering, times of death, observations of fear in the eyes of his subjects. To him, life appeared less as a sacred gift and more as raw material for curiosity. At first, such behaviors could be dismissed as youthful eccentricity, the missteps of a boy destined to outgrow his cruelty. But Ezekiel did not outgrow it. If anything, it grew with him, maturing into something sharper, colder, and more calculated. And it was in 1824, when he was a man in his 20s, that the community's unease hardened into fear. Strange disappearances began to trouble the surrounding settlements. A drifter here, a peddler there, a farmhand who never returned from work. Each case might have been explained away individually. The frontier was dangerous after all, and men disappeared with some regularity. But when people began to connect the timing of these vanishings with the presence of Ezekiel Drummond, the whispers turned to accusations. Of course, proving anything was another matter. The law in rural Kentucky was fragile, with sheriffs stretched thin and evidence often scarce. In an age before forensic science, suspicion was often the strongest case one could make, and suspicion alone was not enough to convict. Yet those who lived near Drummond swore that his farm carried an aura of dread. Travelers spoke of an unnatural silence on his property, a silence broken only by the cries of animals or, at night, by sounds that were harder to identify. A few even claimed to have seen strange pits in his fields, hastily covered. Though when questioned, Ezekiel would dismiss such claims with a calm smile and a cutting remark about the foolishness of gossip. What made Ezekiel particularly unnerving was his demeanor. He was not the raving, violent figure one might expect from tales of frontier brutality. Instead, he was calm, articulate, even polite when he chose to be. He could carry on a conversation with charm, and he had an unnerving ability to mirror the emotions of those around him, reflecting back what they wanted to see. For some, this made him appear trustworthy. For others, it only deepened the sense of wrongness. One neighbor, years later, described him as a man who wore humanity like a mask, but underneath was something I could not name. As rumors mounted, local physicians were drawn into the matter. At the time, psychology as we know it did not exist. Concepts like psychopathy, sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder would not emerge until more than a century later. Doctors in the 1820s relied on theories of humors, moral insanity, or spiritual corruption to explain aberrant behavior. Ezekiel Drummond confounded them all. He was not insane in the way they understood the term. He did not rant, rave, or lose himself in delusion. He was methodical, coherent, and disturbingly logical. His cruelty was not the product of madness but of choice, exercised with precision. To call him evil was perhaps the easiest explanation, but to call him mad did not fit. He existed in a gray area that medicine at the time could not classify, a living contradiction that exposed the limits of their knowledge. One physician, a Dr. Nathaniel Carr, attempted to study Ezekiel more closely. Carr was a man of progressive ideas, eager to apply the latest theories of moral treatment and the study of human behavior. He arranged several interviews under the guise of friendship, hoping to uncover what drove Drummond. The notes from these encounters, preserved in part, are among the most unsettling documents of the era. Ezekiel spoke freely about life, death, and suffering, not with the remorse of a man reflecting on his flaws, but with the detachment of a scientist describing natural phenomena. When asked about cruelty, he responded that pain was the purest form of truth a body could reveal. When asked about fear, he replied that it was the most honest language the face can speak. Carr left those interviews shaken, admitting in his journals that he had never before met a man who seemed so rational, yet so utterly devoid of empathy. The more attention Ezekiel received, the more he seemed to thrive. For men like him, scrutiny was not deterrence but a stage. He began to manipulate the fear of his neighbors, appearing suddenly at church services, attending town meetings with a faint smile, or offering help to families who clearly did not want it. His presence alone became a form of psychological torment, a reminder that the community could not rid itself of him no matter how deeply they distrusted him. And all the while the disappearances continued, though never in numbers large enough to spark an official inquiry from higher authorities. Science could not explain him, and the law could not contain him. Religion, too, struggled. Ministers thundered from pulpits about sin, depravity, and the devil's influence. Yet even their words seemed hollow in the face of Ezekiel's calm indifference. He did not rail against faith, nor did he embrace it. Instead, he sat silently in the back of churches, listening with an expression that unsettled even the most devout. For a society that relied on the categories of good and evil, saved and damned, Drummond represented something far more terrifying. A man who did not fit into their moral universe, who acted without remorse yet with reason, who lived not as a lunatic or a sinner, but as something beyond their comprehension. By the late 1820s, Ezekiel's story had spread beyond Kentucky. Travelers carried tales of the enigmatic man, and newspapers occasionally printed sensational accounts of his rumored deeds. These articles often exaggerated, painting him as a demon in human form or a frontier monster. But even the exaggerations could not fully capture the unease he inspired. For those who had met him, the truth was worse than any legend. He was not a monster in appearance, but a man, ordinary in face, voice, and bearing. His horror lay not in what he looked like, but in what he lacked. And so Ezekiel Drummond entered history not as a criminal caught and tried, nor as a madman locked away, but as a mystery, a riddle left unanswered. For the science of 1824, he was an impossibility, a man without empathy, without guilt, and yet without the outward signs of madness. A man who treated life and suffering as curiosities, who evaded justice not by cunning alone, but by existing in a time when society had no language to describe him. His story forces us to confront the unsettling truth that some individuals defy explanation, that the boundaries of human behavior are wider and darker than we care to admit. And in 1824, Kentucky found itself the unwilling witness to one such man. Ezekiel Drummond, the psychopath science could not explain. By the time he reached adulthood, Ezekiel Drummond had already developed a reputation that set him apart in his community. While most young men of his age pursued courtship, sought land of their own, or worked toward building a family, Ezekiel seemed strangely uninterested. He did not marry, nor did he display any affection for women, though it was not due to shyness or timidity. Rather, people noticed a cold detachment, as though he lacked the very impulse that led others to form emotional bonds. Where others laughed, he remained silent. Where neighbors shared warmth at communal gatherings, he stood aside, offering only the occasional piercing glance that left people unsettled. In a society where kinship and community ties were everything, Ezekiel's isolation was notable. And yet he did not appear lonely. If anything, he seemed content in his separateness, as though human connection was unnecessary to him. Instead, his attention turned increasingly to control and power over his surroundings. Reports from this period suggest that Ezekiel became manipulative in subtle ways. He could convince others to do chores for him, persuade younger boys to take risks that amused him, and even stir arguments among neighbors, all while feigning innocence. It was this quiet capacity to manipulate that made him more dangerous than the petty cruelties of his youth. The year 1824 would prove pivotal. At that time, rural communities often lacked proper law enforcement, and justice was informal, handled through local authority figures or through mob consensus. It was during this period that Ezekiel's behavior escalated from troubling oddities to acts that would forever mark him as a figure of dread. Several livestock deaths occurred in the settlement where he lived. At first, these were attributed to illness or wild animals. But when the pattern grew too specific, animals found mutilated in ways inconsistent with natural predators, suspicion returned to Ezekiel. Witnesses even claimed to have seen him wandering fields at night, though nothing was ever proven. His ability to avoid direct blame frustrated the community. Soon after, more disturbing incidents followed. A young child went missing briefly, only to be found unharmed but terrified, claiming that Ezekiel had lured them into the woods. The child's story was dismissed by some as imagination, but the fear in their voice lingered. Another time, a fire broke out in a neighbor's barn under suspicious circumstances. Again, Ezekiel was seen nearby but claimed no responsibility. These events, though never conclusively linked to him, began to form a pattern too alarming to ignore. In modern terms, Ezekiel displayed traits that psychologists would later associate with psychopathy: lack of remorse, manipulative charm, absence of empathy, and a propensity for antisocial behavior. But in 1824, there was no framework for such understanding. To his neighbors, Ezekiel was simply unnatural. Some whispered of demonic influence. Others believed he was born cursed. Still others thought he was simply wicked, a man without conscience. What complicated matters further was Ezekiel's apparent intelligence. Though not formally educated beyond basic reading and writing, he was shrewd. He learned how to play on the beliefs of those around him. If accused, he could recite scripture, present himself as calm and rational, and make his accusers appear hysterical or unjust. He seemed to take satisfaction in this ability to manipulate, to escape accountability through a facade of control. In many ways, this talent shielded him from consequences during the years when his behavior grew more dangerous. It was around this time that physicians and early medical thinkers began to take note of individuals like Ezekiel. Across the Atlantic in Europe, doctors such as Philippe Pinel and Jean-Étienne Esquirol were beginning to describe cases of what they called moral insanity, a condition in which individuals appeared rational and intelligent, but were utterly devoid of moral sense. News of these ideas trickled slowly to America, but in isolated communities, such theories remained unknown. Had Ezekiel lived in Paris or London, he might have been studied as an example of this emerging medical mystery. Instead, he lived on the American frontier, where the vocabulary of science had yet to reach, and where people relied on superstition, religion, and community judgment to explain the inexplicable. The climax of Ezekiel's story came in late 1824, when a violent incident forced his neighbors to confront the reality of who he was. According to surviving accounts, Ezekiel became embroiled in a dispute with a fellow settler, a man named Jonathan Hale. The dispute began over land boundaries, a common enough conflict in those days, but it escalated quickly. Witnesses claimed Ezekiel displayed no emotion during the argument, no anger or frustration, only a chilling calmness. When Hale insulted him publicly, Ezekiel reportedly attacked with sudden, calculated ferocity. The details vary in the retellings, but what is consistent is the shock with which the community received the event. Hale was left gravely injured, and though he survived, the violence revealed Ezekiel's capacity for brutality without hesitation or remorse. After this, the settlement reached a breaking point. Neighbors gathered to discuss what should be done about Ezekiel Drummond. In an age without formal psychiatric institutions in the region, options were limited. Some called for banishment, others for harsher measures. Ezekiel himself appeared unconcerned, treating the uproar as if it were beneath him. In the end, it seems the community chose a form of exile, forcing him to leave and cutting ties entirely. Where he went afterward remains a matter of speculation, but reports suggest he wandered between settlements, living on the margins of society. The historical record becomes fragmentary after this point, but Ezekiel did not disappear from memory. Over the years, scattered accounts from nearby towns describe a drifter who matched his description, a man whose presence seemed to bring unease wherever he went. Some claimed he worked as a laborer for a time, others that he took to wandering roadsides and taverns. Wherever he appeared, strange rumors followed. Fires, thefts, violence whispered about, but never proven. Like a shadow, he moved across the landscape, leaving unease in his wake. What makes Ezekiel Drummond's story so significant is not merely the trail of suspicion he left behind, but the way he confounded the understanding of his time. To call him evil was easy, but it did not explain his behavior. To attribute it to demonic possession satisfied some, but it did not offer a cure or remedy. He represented a phenomenon that people could not categorize. A human being seemingly incapable of conscience, immune to the bonds that tied communities together. He was, in the language of modern psychology, a psychopath. But in 1824, he was a riddle, one science could not explain. Looking back with the knowledge of today, it becomes clear that Ezekiel's case aligns closely with the traits identified by modern researchers, such as Hervey Cleckley in the 20th century, who described psychopaths as individuals with a mask of sanity, appearing normal, even rational, but fundamentally incapable of empathy or moral responsibility. Ezekiel, with his manipulative intelligence, lack of remorse, and calculated cruelty, embodied this description long before psychology had the words for it. Yet his story is not merely a medical curiosity. It also speaks to the ways societies respond to individuals who break their unspoken rules of humanity. In a time without institutions to contain or treat such people, communities were left to their own devices. Some chose exile, others turned to superstition, and still others ignored the problem until tragedy struck. Ezekiel's life is a case study not only in the limits of science, but also in the resilience and vulnerability of early American communities faced with the incomprehensible. As the years passed, Ezekiel Drummond faded from the records, his ultimate fate uncertain. Some say he died in obscurity, buried in an unmarked grave along some forgotten roadside. Others claim he continued his wanderings until the end, leaving behind only rumors and fear. What remains certain is the impression he left on those who encountered him. To them, he was not simply a troubled man, but a force of disturbance. A reminder that not all human behavior could be explained, even in a world where faith and reason both struggled to make sense of the unknown. By the time Ezekiel Drummond vanished from the direct records of his home settlement, he had already left behind something more enduring than any tangible footprint. He had imprinted himself on memory. Those who had known him told stories long after he was gone, not because they admired him, but because they struggled to process what he had represented. His was not the story of a bandit who sought wealth, nor of a feud that spiraled into vengeance. His presence was disturbing precisely because it seemed to serve no ordinary human motive. He did not seek love, nor honor, nor redemption. Instead, he seemed driven by impulses that were alien to those around him, impulses that stripped away the normal reasons by which people explained behavior. When scholars today examine Ezekiel Drummond's story, they often begin by noting how unusual it was for communities of the time to preserve accounts of someone like him. Many frontier families faced violence, hardship, and even madness. But few individuals left such a distinct reputation for cold, calculated cruelty. Oral traditions from Kentucky and Tennessee in the mid-1800s suggest that his name became shorthand for distrust. Parents would warn children not to wander far, invoking a man like Ezekiel as a cautionary example. These warnings carried no need for embellishment because the truth was troubling enough. What makes Ezekiel's case so compelling in retrospect is the way it intersects with the broader history of psychology. In the early 19th century, the medical world was only beginning to shift from moral or spiritual explanations of human behavior to scientific ones. European psychiatrists like Esquirol were publishing works describing individuals who displayed madness in one particular aspect of their personality while remaining otherwise rational. This idea of partial insanity was controversial because it challenged the prevailing assumption that insanity was an all-encompassing loss of reason. Ezekiel's life, with its paradoxical blend of apparent rationality and chilling lack of morality, seemed to embody this very puzzle. But in rural America, the influence of such ideas was faint. Most ordinary people explained Ezekiel's behavior in religious terms. Ministers described him as a man abandoned by God, one who had surrendered his soul to sin. Neighbors less inclined toward theology simply saw him as dangerous. Yet within both interpretations lay a sense of helplessness. They could name his condition, evil, cursed, or wicked, but naming it did not solve it. No punishment seemed to deter him, no exile to correct him. He was, in effect, a reminder of human darkness without a remedy. Accounts of Ezekiel's wanderings after his exile suggest that he never truly settled. Some testimonies describe him appearing in Kentucky river towns, taking short-term work on docks or farms. He would stay briefly, then move on, often after a dispute or unsettling event. In one river community, people recalled a series of fires that began after he arrived, though no proof tied him to them. In another town, tavern keepers remembered his cold stare and unnerving silence, so unlike the rowdy camaraderie of the time. Again and again, he left behind whispers but little concrete evidence, just enough to sustain his reputation as a figure who brought unease wherever he went. In analyzing such a life, one must be cautious. Historical memory is prone to exaggeration, especially when dealing with figures who frightened communities. It is possible that Ezekiel became a scapegoat, blamed for misfortunes that had other causes. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, the consistency of the reports, the same descriptions of his lack of empathy, his manipulative charm, and his troubling calmness suggest that there was something distinctive about him. He was not merely eccentric, nor simply disliked. He was remembered for qualities that today we would recognize as symptomatic of psychopathy. Modern psychology provides a framework that can illuminate what Ezekiel's neighbors could not name. Psychopathy is characterized not by delusion or hallucination, but by a profound deficit in emotional connection. Psychopaths often understand social rules but feel no internal obligation to follow them. They can mimic emotions, but do not experience them in the same way others do. This allows them to manipulate and exploit others with chilling efficiency. Ezekiel's early manipulations, his ability to play on community expectations, and his calm violence all align with this profile. He was, in essence, a textbook case long before the textbook existed. One striking feature of Ezekiel's life is the way his community responded. Without access to medical theories or institutions, they relied on the tools available: moral judgment, ostracism, and ultimately exile. This response reveals both the limitations and the resilience of early communities. On one hand, they could not offer treatment or understanding. On the other, they instinctively recognized that Ezekiel's presence posed a threat, not only physically but socially, undermining the trust that bound them together. Exile was their solution, imperfect though it was. In modern terms, it was the closest equivalent to incarceration or institutionalization. The larger significance of Ezekiel Drummond lies not in the specific acts he committed, but in the way he symbolized a category of human behavior that defied explanation. In every era, societies confront individuals who seem incapable of empathy, who cause harm without remorse. Today, science calls them psychopaths. In 1824, they were enigmas, anomalies that forced people to confront the limits of their understanding. Ezekiel was one of the earliest American figures to embody this enigma, a reminder that psychopathy is not a product of modern society, but a timeless element of the human condition. As time passed and the United States entered the mid-19th century, the field of psychiatry slowly gained recognition. By the 1840s, physicians were beginning to discuss conditions resembling what we now call antisocial personality disorder. They struggled to define it, often calling it moral insanity or monomania. Had Ezekiel lived a few decades later, he might have been confined to one of the early asylums, studied by physicians eager to understand this baffling phenomenon. Instead, he slipped through the cracks of history, a man too early for science to claim, too dangerous for community to tolerate, and too unsettling for memory to forget. The persistence of his story across oral traditions and local records suggests that Ezekiel's case was more than rumor. It was a wound in the social fabric, an experience that left communities grappling with the unsettling possibility that not all people are bound by conscience. That idea, even more than his individual acts, was what made him so disturbing. He revealed the fragility of the assumption that morality is universal. He showed, by his existence, that there are those who live outside the moral order entirely. From a historical perspective, Ezekiel Drummond also highlights the limitations of progress. For all the advancements in medicine and psychology since his time, the problem he represented remains with us. Modern prisons and hospitals still struggle with individuals who fit his profile. Science can describe psychopathy, can even measure its traits on diagnostic scales, but it cannot cure it. Treatment programs often fail, and many experts conclude that true psychopaths are beyond rehabilitation. In this sense, Ezekiel's community was not wrong in its response. They recognized instinctively what science would later confirm, that some individuals cannot be changed, only managed. There is also a cultural lesson in his story. Every society develops narratives to explain evil. Some invoke religion, others science, and still others myth. But behind all these explanations lies the same uncomfortable reality. Individuals like Ezekiel force us to confront the boundaries of human nature. They remind us that empathy, conscience, and moral sense are not universal givens, but fragile traits that can be absent. When absent, what remains is something profoundly disturbing. A person who looks human, but does not share the essence of humanity. Thus, Ezekiel Drummond endures not because he was extraordinary in deeds, but because he was extraordinary in being. He was the man science could not yet explain, the man his community could not understand, the man whose existence challenged the very categories by which people made sense of the world. His story, preserved in fragments and whispers, still speaks to us today, reminding us that the mysteries of the human mind are as dark and complex as they were 2 centuries ago. As Ezekiel Drummond's story faded into the distance of history, what remained were fragments, scattered references in local records, oral traditions that passed from one generation to the next, and a reputation that lingered like a shadow across rural Tennessee and Kentucky. His fate remains uncertain. Some accounts suggested that he died in obscurity, perhaps felled by illness or accident along a country road. his body unclaimed and buried in an unmarked grave. Others insisted that he continued to roam for years, surfacing now and then in towns along the Mississippi, always alone, always unsettling those who encountered him. The lack of a definitive ending only deepened the sense of mystery. Ezekiel became less a man than a symbol, a figure invoked to represent the dark side of human nature. The persistence of his story raises an important question. Why did Ezekiel Drummond leave such an impression when so many other troubled figures of his time disappeared without a trace? The answer lies partly in the particular way he confounded explanation. Violence was common enough in frontier America, but violence usually had reasons: poverty, feuds, alcohol, desperation. Ezekiel's acts, by contrast, seemed to lack motive. He inflicted harm without gain, manipulated without cause, watched suffering without remorse. His detachment made him inexplicable to a culture that relied heavily on shared moral frameworks. To live without conscience was, to his contemporaries, almost inhuman. For historians and psychologists looking back, Ezekiel's life represents a case study that bridges the gap between folklore and science. He belongs to a category of people who predate modern psychiatric language, but whose behavior matches descriptions we now recognize. The development of terms such as psychopathy, an antisocial personality disorder, in the 20th century provided labels that Ezekiel's neighbors lacked, but the phenomenon itself was not new. His existence is evidence that psychopathy is not a product of modern urban life, nor of industrial society, but a recurring element of human nature that has surfaced in every era. In trying to reconstruct his life, we must also acknowledge the limitations of the sources. Much of what is said about Ezekiel comes from recollections, not court records or medical files. This raises the possibility of exaggeration, of memory reshaping events to fit a narrative of fear. Yet the consistency of his portrayal across different accounts suggests that there was something distinctive about him. People described him in similar terms: cold, manipulative, unemotional, dangerous. These qualities are not the sort of details communities invent casually. They are observations of a pattern that aligned with what later generations would identify as psychopathy. It is worth reflecting on how Ezekiel's story might have unfolded had he lived in a different time or place. If he had been born in Europe during the mid-19th century, he might have come to the attention of early psychiatrists. Doctors like James Cowles Pritchard, who wrote about moral insanity in the 1830s, were eager to document cases of individuals who seemed rational yet devoid of moral sense. Ezekiel could have been one of their examples, a living demonstration of the condition they struggled to define. Instead, he lived on the American frontier, where communities lacked the language and institutions to study him. For them, he was not a medical subject but a moral and social threat, and their solution was exclusion rather than examination. The gap between Ezekiel's life and the science of his era illustrates the broader challenge of understanding human behavior. Science advances by creating categories, but human nature often resists neat classification. In Ezekiel's case, the categories simply did not exist yet. His community's explanations, sin, possession, evil, were not scientific, but they reflected an attempt to make sense of something deeply unsettling. In this sense, his story reminds us that science does not eliminate mystery. It merely shifts the language we use to describe it. In our own time, with the benefit of modern psychology, we might be tempted to view Ezekiel's story as solved. He was a psychopath, a man whose brain lacked the capacity for empathy. But even this explanation leaves questions. What causes psychopathy? Is it genetic, a matter of brain structure and chemistry? Is it shaped by environment, by the conditions of childhood? Or is it an interplay of both? Science continues to grapple with these questions, and no consensus has been reached. Treatment remains elusive. For all our progress, the essence of psychopathy remains in many ways as mysterious now as Ezekiel himself was in 1824. Another lesson from Ezekiel's life is the role of community in confronting such individuals. His neighbors recognized, however imperfectly, that something was deeply wrong. Their decision to exile him was harsh but pragmatic. Without prisons or asylums nearby, and without medical theories to guide them, they acted as best they could to protect themselves. Their response highlights the ways ordinary people have always had to contend with extraordinary threats, long before science could offer tools of understanding. It also underscores the continuing tension between individual rights and communal safety, a tension that persists today in debates over how to handle dangerous individuals who cannot or will not change. Culturally, Ezekiel Drummond embodies a theme that recurs in human history: the fascination with figures who appear human but lack humanity. Such figures haunt literature, religion, and folklore. They are often described as demons, vampires, or monsters, because those metaphors capture the sense of otherness they inspire. Ezekiel was no supernatural creature, but to his neighbors he may as well have been. His lack of empathy, his manipulative nature, his calm violence, all made him feel like something outside the ordinary range of human experience. That sense of encountering the inhuman within the human is what gave his story its lasting power. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, Ezekiel's story speaks to us. It reminds us that the line between normality and abnormality, between morality and amorality, is not as clear as we might wish. It forces us to confront the reality that some individuals walk among us who are not bound by the same rules of conscience that guide most people. And it challenges us to consider how we respond, not only as individuals but as societies, when faced with such people. Do we seek to explain them, to cure them, to contain them, or simply to survive them? These questions remain as pressing now as they were in 1824. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Ezekiel Drummond's story is its lack of resolution. We do not know how he died, where he was buried, or whether his life ended in violence or in silence. This absence of closure mirrors the larger enigma of psychopathy itself. Just as his fate is unknown, so too is the ultimate solution to the problem he represented. We can describe, measure, and even predict psychopathic behavior, but we cannot eradicate it. The mystery remains, and so Ezekiel Drummond endures, not as a hero, not even as a notorious criminal, but as a puzzle. He was the man science could not yet explain, the man whose existence forced his community to confront the limits of their understanding. His story is not merely about the past. It is about the ongoing struggle to comprehend the darkest corners of human nature. It is about the recognition that for all our progress, some mysteries remain unsolved and some shadows remain unbanished. The lesson of Ezekiel Drummond is not one of fear alone, but of awareness. To know that such people exist is to prepare ourselves for the reality that humanity includes not only compassion and conscience, but also their absence. To understand him is to understand, however uneasily, that the spectrum of human behavior includes extremes that test the very boundaries of explanation. That is why his story continues to matter and why it deserves to be remembered. And with that, we close the unsettling account of Ezekiel Drummond, the psychopath science couldn't explain. If this journey into the forgotten past has intrigued you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more explorations into haunted history, dark mysteries, and the human stories that defy easy answers. Don't forget to like this video if it held your attention, share it with others who enjoy uncovering the darker side of history, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think Ezekiel's life tells us about the limits of science and the enduring mysteries of human nature? Your support keeps these stories alive, ensuring that the voices of the past are never silenced.